The wind screamed across the frozen tundra, carrying with it the whispers of the dead. In the remote town of Wrangell, Alaska, darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was alive, creeping into every crevice, settling deep into the bones of those who dared to call this place home. The snow fell relentlessly, a white curtain that muffled every sound and erased every trace of life. Locals called it the silence, a time when even the ravens refused to cry, when the whole town seemed to hold its breath. It was during one of those endless nights in January 1998 that Dale Rourke vanished. Dale was a fisherman, born and raised in Wrangell, a man of few words but dependable hands. He lived alone in a weather-beaten cabin by the harbor, a man whose only comfort came from the sea. His neighbors would often see the dim glow of his cabin light flickering late into the night, a sign that he was repairing nets or charting the tides. That evening, he'd driven his old blue Ford truck to the docks as usual, preparing for a midnight fishing trip. The tide was high, the water dark and glassy under the glow of the harbor lights. When the sun rose the next morning, the truck was still there, engine humming, headlights piercing through the falling snow. The driver's door was open, a thermos of coffee resting on the dashboard, still warm. There were blood smears on the side of the truck, leading down toward the edge of the docks. Then they simply stopped. No footprints, no drag marks beyond that point. It was as if Dale Rourke had stepped off the earth and into the icy void. The town sheriff, Harold Yates, was an old man whose hands shook too much to hold a flashlight steady. He'd seen enough disappearances to know when something wasn't right, and this one reeked of more than just an accident. He called in help from Juneau, and that's when Detective Lena Maddox arrived. She was 38, sharp-eyed and known for her refusal to quit a case no matter how cold it got. When she stepped off the bush plane, the wind cut through her coat like knives. She'd been warned about Wrangell's peculiar brand of silence, but she hadn't expected it to feel like this. A heaviness that pressed on her chest the moment she arrived. At the harbor, she found the scene exactly as Yates described. The truck still idled softly, its exhaust mingling with the mist rising from the water. The blood trail had frozen in dark streaks against the planks of the dock. A fisherman's knife lay nearby. The handle cracked, the blade bent slightly at the tip. Maddox crouched beside it, brushing away a layer of frost with her gloved hand. He struggled, she murmured half to herself. Yates grunted, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. Or someone made it look like he did. When the divers went into the water that afternoon, they found nothing. The current was strong, the visibility poor. They surfaced shaking their heads, saying only that the sea had claimed another one. Maddox didn't buy it. She spent the next 2 days interviewing the locals, sitting in dim diners and overheated bars, asking questions that no one wanted to answer. The people of Wrangell had learned long ago that the less you said, the safer you were. Still, one old man, a retired fisherman named Gus Halverson, told her something that made the hair on her neck stand up. He said Dale had found something strange in his nets 2 weeks before he disappeared. Something he wouldn't talk about, but something that scared him. When Maddox pressed for details, Gus just shook his head. "You don't go dragging up what's meant to stay down," he said. "The sea gives and takes, and when it takes, you don't go looking." His words stuck with her. That night, Maddox stood alone on the dock, staring out at the black water. The wind whipped around her, carrying the faint clang of metal from the boats tied nearby. She imagined Dale standing in this exact spot, pulling something heavy from the depths, something that didn't belong in this world. The thought made her chest tighten. The sea here wasn't like anywhere else. It wasn't just cold, it was hungry. On the third morning, the weather turned brutal. Snow came down in thick sheets, and even the harbor lights disappeared into the white. Maddox was about to return to her motel when the call came through the radio. Another man was missing. His name was Joe Denton, a mechanic who lived near the docks and had been known to drink with Dale. His wife reported him missing after he failed to come home for 2 nights. Maddox's pulse quickened as she arrived at Joe's small shack. The front door hung open, the wood splintered near the lock. Inside, the floor was wet with melted snow. The table had been overturned and there was a smear of blood on the wall, as if someone had been dragged. In the corner, under a pile of fishing gear, Maddox found something that made her blood run cold. A torn piece of waterproof fabric, the kind used in heavy-duty raincoats smeared with a mix of engine oil and blood. She placed it in an evidence bag, but her hands trembled. The smell of oil was sharp, almost metallic, and something about it felt familiar. It wasn't just any oil. It smelled like the kind used on older fishing vessels, ones with engines that hadn't been updated in decades. That detail lodged itself in her mind as she looked around the small, trashed cabin. On the wall hung an old photograph of Dale and Joe standing together, holding a massive halibut between them, both grinning wide. The thought that both men were now gone made her chest ache in a way she didn't expect. When she stepped back outside, the snow had stopped. The world was eerily still. She could hear the faint creaking of boats against the dock and the distant howl of the wind over the bay. As she walked toward her truck, she noticed something etched into the frost on the hood. A single line that hadn't been there before. It read, "He found what wasn't his." Maddox froze, the hair on her arms rising beneath her jacket. She looked around, but the harbor was deserted. Only her footprints marked the snow. Someone had been close enough to touch her vehicle to watch her, and she hadn't even noticed. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat at the small wooden desk in her motel room, the evidence bag on the table beside her, the piece of torn fabric catching the faint light from the lamp. She thought about Dale's quiet life, Joe's disappearance, and the strange message. Whatever Dale had found, it wasn't just some old relic or lost crate, it was something worth killing for. The people of Wrangell were hiding something, and she could feel it pulsing beneath the surface like a heartbeat in the ice. At 3 a.m, she stepped outside for air. The town was completely silent, the sky low and heavy with clouds. In the distance, she saw the harbor lights flickering, and then she saw it, a shadow moving between the boats. A figure, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy parka, walking slowly along the docks. Maddox's breath caught in her throat. She called out, but the figure didn't turn. It kept walking until it reached the very edge of the pier. Then, as if swallowed by the night itself, it was gone. The next morning, the harbor was covered in a thin layer of ice. Workers found another smear of blood near the same spot where Dale's trail had ended. Maddox stood there staring at the water, her reflection distorted by ripples. Somewhere beneath that sheet of ice, the truth waited. The sea had taken Dale Rourke and now Joe Denton, and Maddox could feel it watching her too. In Wrangell, Alaska, the darkness had a rhythm of its own. It swallowed men whole, buried secrets beneath the waves, and waited for someone brave or foolish enough to dig them back up. Lena Maddox was determined to be that someone. But as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the silence crept back over the town, even she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness wasn't done yet. It was only getting started, you said. By January, the town of Wrangell had changed. The smiling faces that once greeted newcomers were now replaced with tight-lipped stares and half-closed doors. The fishermen who once gathered at the docks to trade stories over coffee now kept their distance, whispering to one another when they thought no one was listening. The sea, their livelihood, had turned into something they feared. Detective Lena Maddox could feel it in the air. The unease, the guilt, the thick silence that clung to the town like frost. Every time she walked through the main street, people lowered their eyes, pretending not to see her. She had been in small towns before, but this one was different. It wasn't just secrecy. It was terror. The second disappearance had shaken the town to its core. Joe Denton's body was still missing, and the little blood evidence they had only deepened the mystery. Maddox sat inside the sheriff's office, surrounded by maps and photographs. The walls were covered with aerial shots of the harbor, lists of missing persons, and handwritten notes she had gathered during interviews. Sheriff Yates stood nearby, his breath steaming in the cold air. The old heater in the corner rattled weakly but gave no warmth. You think it's connected to whatever Dale found? Yates asked, his voice low and uncertain. Maddox nodded slowly. I don't think, Sheriff, I know. The message on my truck wasn't random. Whoever's behind this doesn't want me digging. That tells me I'm getting close. Yates rubbed his hands together. Dale was a good man. Kept to himself. Only thing he ever loved was the sea. Maddox studied the photos again, her eyes narrowing. And the sea took him. But not before he found something that wasn't meant to be found. 3 days later, the Coast Guard called in. They had found something unusual near the harbor while scanning the seabed. A large metal object tangled in fishing net. When Maddox arrived, the divers were already pulling it onto the dock. It was a chest, old and rusted, about the size of a cooler. The surface was thick with barnacles and seaweed, but when they chipped it open, everyone fell silent. Inside were gold coins, dull but unmistakable, their edges engraved with Cyrillic lettering. There were also ornate trinkets, rings, pins, and a small dagger wrapped in oilskin. The final item was a set of papers, preserved surprisingly well despite the water. Maddox carefully lifted them, her gloves slick with moisture, and could make out faint Russian writing across the pages. She had them sent for translation immediately. That night, Maddox couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling of her motel room, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the windows. She felt it in her gut. This chest was what Dale had found. This was what he had pulled from the depths before vanishing. But why would anyone kill for it? By morning, the translator called. The papers were military records from the 1940s, documenting a Russian submarine expedition that had gone missing during World War II. The submarine's mission had been to transport gold and valuable artifacts from the Russian Far East to a safe location. But the vessel had never arrived. According to the documents, it had gone down somewhere along the Alaskan coast. Maddox's mind raced. If the documents were real, there could be more gold still buried in those waters. News of the discovery spread through Wrangell faster than wildfire. Suddenly, fishermen who had avoided the docks were returning, their eyes sharp with greed. Maddox saw the change immediately. Hope mixed with desperation. Even Yates warned her to keep the find quiet, but it was too late. Word had already reached the wrong people. 2 nights later, someone broke into the Coast Guard storage facility where the chest had been kept. The guards reported hearing footsteps, but by the time they arrived, the intruder was gone. Nothing was stolen, but Maddox found a single note left behind on her desk in the sheriff's office. It was written in black ink on a damp piece of paper. Stop digging or you'll join them. There were no fingerprints, no distinct handwriting, just a faint oily smudge at the bottom corner that smelled like diesel fuel. That evening, Maddox sat in her truck outside the harbor, staring at the lights reflecting off the water. A storm was coming in fast. She could feel the electric charge in the air, the kind that made the hairs on your arms stand on end. Then she saw it, a figure standing by the water's edge, half shrouded by the fog. The person wore a thick parka with a fur-lined hood, face hidden. She stepped out of her truck and called out, but the wind swallowed her words. The figure turned and walked into the mist. She followed, her boots crunching over the snow, her flashlight cutting through the fog. But when she reached the spot, there was nothing. Only footprints leading to the end of the dock and then stopping. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air, just like Dale Rourke. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle calm. Maddox went to the harbor early, coffee in hand, scanning the water for any sign of movement. That's when she saw something glinting beneath a thin layer of ice near the edge of the dock. She called the divers immediately. When they broke through the ice, what they found made her blood turn to ice. A hand, stiff and pale, reaching up through the frozen water. The fingers were curled tightly around a gold coin. When they pulled the body out, the face was unrecognizable at first, bloated from weeks in the water. But Maddox didn't need the coroner to tell her who it was. Dale Rourke had come back from the deep. The autopsy revealed bruising around his neck and deep cuts on his wrists and ankles, suggesting he had been tied or restrained. There was also evidence that he had been alive when thrown into the water. Maddox stared at the report, her mind racing. Whoever killed Dale wanted to make sure he stayed silent. But the sea had other plans. She sat in her car after the autopsy, staring at the mountains in the distance. The sky was a dull gray, the kind that promised more snow. Wrangell seemed to shrink under it. The buildings hunched as if trying to hide. That evening, she met with Yates again at the diner. The place was nearly empty, only the sound of the coffee pot hissing behind the counter. Yates looked exhausted. "You think it's one of our own?" he asked quietly. Maddox stirred her coffee slowly. "Someone in this town knows more than they're saying. Someone who was close to Dale. Maybe even helped him find that chest." Yates frowned. "You think Dale told anyone what he found?" "I think he told the wrong person," Maddox said. "And that person decided to cash in." Outside, the wind picked up again. A loose sign rattled against the diner wall. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Maddox watched the snow swirling through the parking lot. A white veil over the empty cars. Her gut told her this was only the beginning. Back at her motel, she checked her door before locking it for the night. Everything looked normal, but something felt off. Her instinct screamed that she wasn't alone. She glanced out the window, and for a brief moment she saw movement. A shadow crossing the street, pausing under a streetlight, then vanishing into the dark. She waited for hours, hand resting on the gun holstered beside her. But no one came. The next morning she woke to the sound of gulls and a knock on her door. It was Yates, pale and breathless. "You'd better come down to the docks," he said. "We've got another problem." When they arrived, the fishermen were gathered in a tight circle near the water. Maddox pushed through the crowd, and what she saw made her stomach twist. Someone had carved words into the wooden railing of the dock with a knife. The letters were jagged and uneven but clear. He found what wasn't his. The same message that had been scratched into the frost on her truck. Maddox stared at it for a long time, her breath fogging the air. She felt the weight of the gold coin she had taken from the evidence bag earlier, pressing against her coat pocket like a curse. Whatever Dale had uncovered had woken something in this town. Something ancient, greedy, and merciless. The sea had kept its secret for decades, but now it seemed determined to reclaim what was stolen. Maddox realized that Wrangell wasn't just hiding a crime, it was protecting it. And she was standing in the middle of a storm that was only beginning to break. The longer Detective Lena Maddox stayed in Wrangell, the more she understood that the town itself was her enemy. The snow-covered streets looked peaceful from the outside, but beneath the quiet facades of the houses and the polite nods from townsfolk was something rotten. Everyone knew something about the deaths of Dale Rourke and Joe Denton, but no one would speak. The silence wasn't born from ignorance, it was fear. The kind of fear that took root over generations, passed down like a warning whispered from parent to child. Maddox could feel it everywhere she went, in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, in the way eyes lingered on her too long from behind curtained windows. Her investigation had become a storm within a storm. The recovered chest of gold and relics had confirmed that Dale had stumbled onto something enormous, something linked to the vanished Russian submarine from World War II. But the more she learned, the more it became clear that this wasn't a simple story of lost treasure and greed. There were people, powerful people, who knew about the gold long before Dale's discovery. People who would do anything to keep it hidden. The name came to her through a whisper, half drunk and trembling, from a man named Eric Bannon. He was a thin, hollow-eyed fisherman with weathered skin and a voice rough from years of cigarettes and cold air. Maddox found him in a rundown bar near the harbor, sitting alone with a glass of whiskey. He had been one of Dale's closest friends and fishing partners. She approached quietly, flashing her badge as she sat across from him. "I heard you were with Dale the week before he disappeared," she said. Bannon didn't look at her, just swirled his drink and muttered, "That was a mistake." "What did he find?" Maddox pressed. For a long time, Bannon said nothing. The jukebox hummed softly in the corner and the sound of the wind battered the windows. Finally, he whispered, "He pulled something up that night. Something heavy. I told him to throw it back, but he didn't listen." He looked up, his eyes red and glassy. "You don't take from the sea what it doesn't give freely." Maddox leaned in. "The chest? The one we found?" Bannon's hand tightened around his glass. "That was just one of them. There's more down there. Dale wanted to bring it all up. Said we could finally leave this godforsaken place. But he didn't know who it belonged to." "Who?" she asked. He hesitated, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They call him the captain. No one's ever seen his face, but he runs things around here. Smuggling, black market trade, gold, whatever brings in money. You don't cross him and live to talk about it." Maddox's pulse quickened. "You're telling me the captain had Dale killed?" Bannon glanced toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through it. "You don't say that name out loud, detective. You shouldn't even be here." Before she could ask more, he stood up abruptly, dropping money on the bar, and walked out into the cold night. She followed, but by the time she stepped outside, he was gone, vanished into the snow as silently as he had appeared. 2 days later, a Coast Guard officer reported an abandoned outpost north of Wrangell. It had once been a refueling station but had been deserted for years. Locals said Dale and Bannon had been seen heading that way before he vanished. Maddox decided to go there herself. She took a snowmobile, the wind biting at her face as she rode across the frozen shoreline. The sky was a dull, endless gray, and the world seemed carved from ice. When she reached the outpost, the building loomed out of the fog like a ghost. Its windows were shattered, its roof half collapsed under the weight of snow. She pushed open the creaking door, her flashlight cutting through the dark interior. Inside, it smelled of salt, rust, and decay. Old fishing equipment lay scattered on the floor along with empty cans and a rusted oil drum. On one wall, someone had carved words deep into the wood with a knife. "The sea takes what's hers." She moved slowly through the building, her breath visible in the cold air. Near the back, she found an old radio transmitter, its wires tangled and corroded. There were signs of recent use, fresh footprints in the dust, an oil lamp that still smelled faintly of kerosene, and a few empty cans of food stacked in the corner. Someone had been here recently. As she examined the transmitter, she heard something outside, the crunch of footsteps on snow. She froze, listening. Another step, then another. She turned off her flashlight, drawing her weapon. Through a crack in the wall, she saw a shadow move across the snow. A tall figure in a heavy parka, walking slowly around the building. She waited, her heart hammering. Then, as suddenly as it came, the shadow was gone. Maddox stepped outside cautiously, her boots sinking into the snow. The wind howled across the open plain, and the sea groaned beneath the ice in the distance. "Hello?" she called out, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. She walked a few yards toward the tree line and found a cigarette still burning in the snow. Whoever had been there was gone, but not long ago. That night, back in town, she received a call at her motel. The number was blocked. When she answered, a distorted voice rasped through the static. "You shouldn't have gone there, detective. You're in over your head." Maddox gripped the phone tightly. "Who is this?" Silence for a moment. Then the voice replied, "Stop digging. It's already too late." The line went dead. Sleep was impossible after that. She sat awake, staring out the window, watching the snow fall under the orange glow of the streetlights. Every shadow looked like a person. Every sound made her heart jump. She knew she was being watched. She just didn't know by whom. By dawn, the snow had stopped and the town was eerily quiet again. Maddox drove to the docks to meet Yates, but when she arrived, she saw flashing lights and a small crowd gathered near a fishing shack. Yates waved her over, his face pale and drawn. "We found Bannon," he said quietly. Her stomach sank. Inside the shack, the air was freezing and still. Bannon's body lay sprawled on the floor, his throat cut, his eyes open and staring blankly at the ceiling. A single gold coin rested on his tongue. Maddox knelt beside him, her chest heavy. Whoever the captain was, he was sending a message loud and clear. Anyone who talked would end up the same way. She stood up, clenching her fists. The pattern was obvious now. Dale had found the gold. He'd told Bannon. Bannon had talked to her. And now both were dead. She was next. That night, she sat in her motel room again, her gun on the nightstand, her badge beside it. She turned the gold coin over in her hand, studying its worn engraving. She thought about Dale's face, about Bannon's last words, about the shadow outside the outpost. The captain was real, and he was close. She could almost feel him breathing down her neck. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees. The lights flickered once, then steadied. In the distance, she thought she heard the faint rumble of an engine. A snowmobile, maybe, moving somewhere out near the harbor. She went to the window and looked out, but all she could see was the endless white. Then for just a heartbeat, she saw him. A figure standing at the edge of the street watching her room. Tall, still, the same parka, the same silence. When she blinked, he was gone. She didn't sleep that night, and by morning, she had made up her mind. The captain wanted her to stop digging, but she was done playing defense. She would find him no matter how deep the ice went, no matter how dangerous it became. Because something about Wrangell, something about the gold, went far beyond murder. It was about power, history, and the kind of darkness that didn't end just because you uncovered it. It only got darker. You said, spring came early that year, though in Wrangell it was hard to tell the difference. The snow melted slowly, revealing patches of black earth and rotting driftwood along the shore. The ice that had once sealed the harbor began to crack, breaking apart like shattered glass under the pale sunlight. The thaw revealed more than just the muddy banks. It exposed the secrets buried beneath the frozen silence. Detective Lena Maddox stood at the edge of the docks as the divers worked below, her coat whipping in the cold wind. They had been searching the harbor floor for weeks, guided by the coordinates found in Dale Rourke's recovered journal, and now they were finally surfacing with something. One after another, crates rose from the depths, encrusted with barnacles and rust, heavy with history and greed. Each one contained gold coins, artifacts, and relics stamped with Russian insignia. Maddox watched as they were lined up along the dock, each chest a piece of a puzzle that had cost lives. She should have felt satisfaction, but all she felt was dread. The sea had given up its treasure, but it had not given up its curse. Standing a few feet away, Sheriff Yates looked as though he had aged 10 years overnight. "So it's true," he said quietly. "All that gold, just sitting there under our noses for decades." Maddox nodded. "And people died for it. Dale Joe Bannon. Maybe more we don't even know about." Yates turned to her. "You really think this captain is behind it all?" "I don't think," she said, her voice steady despite the unease twisting in her gut. "I know he's been watching me since I got here. He wants what's left of the gold. And now that we've brought it up, he'll come for it." That night, the gold was transferred to a secure facility guarded by state police. The town was on edge. Rumors spread that the treasure was cursed, that anyone who touched it would end up at the bottom of the sea. Maddox stayed up late in her motel room, reviewing her notes, piecing together every detail she'd gathered. The captain wasn't just some mythical smuggler. He was real. Someone who operated in the shadows of Wrangell for years, maybe even decades. The stories about him stretched back to the 70s. An unknown man who controlled the illegal trade routes up and down Alaska's coast, using old fishing vessels and abandoned coves as his hideouts. No one knew his face, only his calling card. A single gold coin left at every scene of death or disappearance. Just as Maddox was about to turn in, her phone rang. The number was blocked again. Her pulse quickened as she answered. "You've done well, Detective," a calm male voice said. "But you've taken what belongs to me." Her stomach turned cold. "Who is this?" "You know who," the voice replied. "You're standing on my shore. You've touched what's mine, and now you'll pay the same price as the others." The line went dead before she could respond. She stared at the phone, her reflection pale in the black screen. She knew it was him, the captain. When she went outside, she found her car window shattered. On the driver's seat, a single gold coin lay glinting in the faint light. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The engraving was identical to the coins recovered from the sea, but this one had been polished until it gleamed like new. It wasn't a warning anymore, it was a declaration. The next morning, Maddox gathered a small team to set a trap. They would use the recovered gold as bait, spreading word quietly that it was being transported to Juneau that night. If the captain was watching, and she was certain he was, he wouldn't be able to resist. Yates tried to talk her out of it. "You're walking into a storm, Maddox," he warned. "You don't even know what this man looks like." She holstered her gun and met his eyes. "Then it's time I found out." By nightfall, the docks were cloaked in fog, the air thick with moisture and tension. A single shipping container sat near the water, supposedly filled with the gold. 2 officers were stationed nearby, pretending to guard it. Maddox hid behind a stack of crates with Yates, watching the shadows dance across the mist. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the wooden pylons. Then she heard it, the faint crunch of boots on the dock. A figure emerged from the fog, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long captain's coat and gloves. His face was obscured by a weathered leather mask. He moved with calm precision, not like a thief sneaking in, but like a man returning to claim what was rightfully his. He approached the container, his boots echoing on the wood. Maddox stepped out, gun raised. "Don't move." The man stopped but didn't turn. "Detective Maddox," he said softly, his voice deep and measured. "You should have left it alone." "Turn around," she ordered. He did slowly, the mask catching the pale light from the harbor lamps. His eyes, visible through narrow slits, were cold and gray like the sea itself. "You think you've uncovered some mystery," he said. "But this gold was never lost. It was protected. The sea took it for a reason." "You killed them," she said, stepping closer. "Dale, Joe, Bannon, they died because of you." "I didn't kill them," he replied calmly. "The sea did. They woke something that was never meant to be disturbed, and now you've done the same." She tightened her grip on the gun. "You're under arrest." The captain tilted his head slightly, then smiled behind the mask. "You don't arrest the tide, Detective. You can't stop what's already coming." Before she could react, he moved. In one swift motion, he lunged forward, knocking her gun aside. They struggled, their boots slipping on the slick wood. The dock groaned beneath them as the waves crashed harder against the supports. Maddox fought to regain her balance, slamming her elbow into his ribs, but he barely flinched. His strength was unreal, his grip like iron. Suddenly, the old dock gave way beneath them. The wood splintered, sending both plunging into the freezing black water. The shock of the cold stole Maddox's breath. She thrashed, reaching for the surface, gasping as her head broke through the waves. She saw the captain beside her, his coat heavy with water dragging him down. For a moment, their eyes met through the swirling darkness. He reached out, his gloved hand clutching a gold coin that shimmered in the water like fire. Then he sank, vanishing beneath the ice. Maddox fought her way to the shore, pulling herself up onto the slick rocks, coughing violently. The harbor was silent again, the fog closing in. She waited for him to resurface, but he never did. Days later, divers scoured the water but found nothing. No body, no trace of the captain, only one coin wedged between the rocks near where he disappeared. Maddox left Wrangell a week later, her report filed and the case officially marked as closed but unresolved. The gold was confiscated by the state, locked away in evidence storage destined to be studied, catalogued, and forgotten. But Maddox couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. Months passed and she returned to Juneau. Yet Wrangell haunted her dreams. Some nights she woke gasping, the sound of waves crashing in her ears, the image of that mask staring at her from beneath the water. She told herself it was over, that the captain was dead, but deep down she knew better. A year later, a fisherman in Wrangell reported seeing a figure standing on the docks late at night. He described a tall man in a captain's coat, staring out at the horizon. When he called out, the figure turned slightly, the moonlight glinting off something metallic in his hand, a gold coin. The next morning, the fisherman found one of his nets torn to shreds and the words, "The sea takes what's hers," carved into the side of his boat. When news of it reached Maddox, she didn't respond. She simply stared out her window at the icy waters of Juneau Harbor, her reflection merging with the dark sea beyond. Some stories never end. Some truths stay buried until the sea decides to reveal them again. And in Alaska, where the silence is deeper than death itself, there are secrets that the cold will always keep. Until someone else, someone just as curious and desperate, comes along to dig them back up.